Hey there, boils and ghouls. Welcome to this week's episode of Hollow Weekly. Nick here with special guest Julian David Stone, author of It's Alive. The premise of this book alone, like when you see it, you know it's Frankenstein.
Right.
There is something so gnarly about it being the days leading up to Frankenstein. Like, it might be because, like, I love movies and, like, pre-production seems like it's always half the battle. Mm-hmm. But, like, the countdown to the beginning of this movie is exhilarating.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thanks for having me on, first of all. It's great to be on here. Yeah, that's what, as a writer, you're always looking to create tension. And when I discovered this, all it's historical fiction, but it's based on fact that there was this back and forth leading up very close to the beginning of the production of Frankenstein. That's where it became sort of irresistible to sort of build the tension and, of what those last days must have been like to portray it in a book.
How did this book come about? Like, when did you start to discover that, leading up to this was quite chaotic?
Well, I had an interesting journey, like a lot of people, to these movies. As a kid, I was a big fan of them. Mm-hmm. This was the early 70s. There was a big revival of them in the 60s and the 70s with the Aurora model kits and all of that. And I did all of that. And then, as I got older, I moved into other things. I discovered girls, all the stuff that's sort of as you get older. And I kind of left them behind. And then in the late 90s, I sort of started watching them again, and I saw them completely differently, obviously, as an adult than I had seen them as a child. And I found them far more complex than I remembered and far more interesting. So I decided I wanted to look into the history of them. And I started doing that, and I started reading about them, and I found it really fascinating. And my first idea, then it started to turn into like, okay, I was a screenwriter at the time, and now I'm writing novels. Is there a story there that I can do something with? And my initial idea was I thought it was fascinating that you had this iconic character of Frankenstein, but there were all these different actors that played him. Mm-hmm. And I thought, okay, maybe there's an interesting story in that. And I started looking deeper and deeper. And then finally, when I started looking at the original Frankenstein, and I discovered, one, this chaos that went on right up to the beginning of production, which happens in a lot of films, but it was so fascinating that you're talking about Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff, two such famous people, and that, it had been forgotten that Bela Lugosi was almost Frankenstein. In fact, initially was supposed to be. And then the real aha moment was when I discovered Junior Lemley, who was running Universal at the time, that this studio was being run by a 21-year-old, and he was the reason the films got made, that nobody else in Hollywood wanted to go near these films, being Dracula and particularly Frankenstein. And that's where I really locked in, and that's where the story took off. Once I discovered him, I was like, you got to be kidding me. That, there was so much more that came out of that the farther I looked into it. And he's such a fascinating character, Junior Lemley, as well as obviously Karloff and Lugosi.
Was there anything, like, what was the research like? Did anything pop up that you didn't know before?
So much. It was so fun reading about the films. I read everything I could get. I love contemporaneous history. I do. The most important thing to me, and what I spent most of my time on, was reading stuff from the period. That's what I really enjoy, reading the trades from back and then.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Oh, it's just fascinating. And, the one thing you learn, it's almost like with anything in life, but particularly with the film business, nothing is new. All the cliches of Hollywood existed in 1931 that exist today. And so it was fun just seeing those. And a really big moment for me in the development of the book was, things were going along, but the story wasn't quite coming together. And then I had this real aha moment where I went, you know what? I'm focusing too much on the Universal monster films. I need to take a step back and really look at what Hollywood was in 1931.
Right.
So I pulled back, and at the time I was only concentrating and watching Universal films. I said, no, I need to see what every studio was making, and I read all of the magazines I could get from the period, like Photo Play and the Movie Star magazines. And I started with the novel takes place in August of 1931, but I started with January of 1931, and I read several different of these magazines all the way up and through that period of time. And it was so fascinating to watch stars rise and fall, like they do today. And that just gave me a better feel about what was going on then. And in particular, you're talking about a couple of years into the sound era. So that's still a big debate. Like they, you can read stuff in early 1931. By then, people have accepted the silent movie is gone. But you go back about a year, there's still people saying, "Oh, this is a fluke." This sound thing's going to go away. And so, I mean, that's how quickly it was changing. In fact, if you look at Dracula, Dwight Frye's makeup in several scenes still looks like silent movie makeup. I want
to go back and look at
take a look at it. He's got the eyeliner and stuff like that, you don't see that in Frankenstein, but Dracula still has touches, just a little bit of a silent movie. And I believe, I've never found an account, I've never been able to see an ad for this, but and I don't think it exists anymore, but my understanding is that Dracula was actually released as a silent film also.
Whoa.
Yeah, that it was still close enough to the era of silent films that there were still theaters outside of the major cities that hadn't been equipped for sound yet. So when Dracula obviously is a sound film, but there was a cut made by Universal that was silent that went around. And I don't know if that's ever been shown, but that would be fascinating.
We'll have to shake down the folks at Universal.
Yeah.
To tell us.
Yeah.
It's so wild to think about that because like right now I feel like at least what we were able to go, like have lived through would be like the digital filmmaking.
Mm-hmm.
It's and that is radical in and out of itself because it's made it a lot more accessible to everyone else. It's crazy to think about how sound, like the one pivotal thing that we need, of them be like, oh, absolutely not, no way.
And also what is really fascinating, because sound, the Jazz Singers 1927, and everybody kind of looks at that as the first big sound hit, and that's certainly the one that really started the revolution. There'd been a few little things before them, but that was the one where people went, okay, this, we want more of this. But nobody knew at that point, what is a sound movie? Like, are they going to want sound effects and dialogue? Maybe they just want sound effects. Maybe they don't. It's a whole evolution. It's not just like, oh, okay, sound film. This is a sound film. Nobody really knew. So for those first few years, you have some fascinating hybrids where there may be no dialogue, but occasionally they recorded, music, background music, or even sound effects. It's about 1932, 33, where if you look at a film from that period, obviously it looks like a very old film, right, but the relationship of sound to pictures is what we're used to. That's about when they sort of figure out, oh, okay, this is what it's going to be. But you go back in those in-between years, there's some really fascinating hybrids where they still just don't quite know what an audience is going to expect from a sound film.
Oh, my God. Like, they were literally just trying to create this brand new art form and seeing what stuck.
Completely. In fact, this is sort of a tangent, but I went to the Turner Classic Movie Festival. I don't know if you've ever been to that. It's a wonderful film festival. That sounds
fun.
Yeah, it's out here in Hollywood. They do it every year, and I ended up in line with waiting for a movie with one of the guys. It's terrible. I think it's Craig Barron, who won an Academy Award for Star Wars, and he would for sound effects, cool, and he would always do presentations there. And I said, I have a question for you. How did they edit sound back then? Because this is when they were recording on discs. How was the editing done? And he said, I'll tell you the truth, there's some aspects of it that we still don't know exactly how they did it, even though it's a relatively modern age and the technology was evolving so quickly. But just the thought that that's how crazy it was in those early days. There were competing systems for doing sound films, and some of it has actually been lost.
Wow. The one thing that I think about sometimes, because like I only worked in the industry very rarely, but like I always imagined like whenever we would have a shoot on some ranch off like a beaten path with no GPS, I'm like, that sucks alone, showing up to set with no GPS, let alone try to figure out how do we edit sound. Like there are challenges. We're up here.
Well, I started working in the film business really in the 80s and the early 90s, and I can tell you some of the stories and of finding locations and like putting signs up. I produced this film that we shot in the desert, sort of outside of Victorville, and it was a mess. People would miss the sign.
Oh my God.
And then they just keep going, and they're just driving for hours into the desert, and there's no cell phone to call up, and
oh my God.
Yeah. So we I have a lot of memories around that.
Jeez, that sounds like a nightmare.
Yeah.
You pulled through. So when you were doing the research, you said you watched a lot of movies. Did you run into like any real underrated gems, like any movies that just stood out?
So many. What's also fun of this period that my book takes place in Frankenstein is it's the pre-code era. So I don't know how much, your listeners are, there was this period when sound comes in 28 until 1934 where there was really no limits on what you could put on the screen. And in fact, things got, by the standards of today, the stuff is pretty mild, but at the time, it sort of got a little bit more and more outrageous. And finally, they instituted a code in 1934, which limited all kinds of stuff you could do on screen, and that stayed in place until about the mid 60s, where people started to sort of ignore it and stuff. So seeing that was a lot of fun. There was a lot of sort of outrageous behavior, a lot of drinking, a lot of sexual stuff that you didn't expect. There was one film in particular that I love. We were talking just before, I believe we went on the air, about how the cliches of the film business don't change. There's a film from either 1929 or 1930 called Showgirl in Hollywood, and it's about a showgirl from New York who gets, invited to come to Hollywood to have this big career, and every cliche of the film business is in it. The casting couch, you're too old. Everything you can imagine is in this film. And that was one of the ones that I discovered that was really fun to watch, just to see how nothing's changed.
Damn. Tale as old as time.
Yep.
It's in the book, there's so many stories that like the one thing that I wrote there was where did I put it? Of people losing sight of themselves. Like I really felt that with Carl and with Bella. They both had this image of something they were wanting to hold on to, and they couldn't let it go. And if they did, Carl did very last minute before Junior almost ran him over with the bulldozer. But Bella was a day late, and I thought that story is so interesting because everybody has that, and I feel like that's a cliche in life that everyone and I felt that way too artistically. You a couple years passed, you're like, well, why haven't I done this one thing? And then you kind of have to regain yourself. Carl eventually, luckily, did last minute. And Frankenstein went in. But I thought the way that you told those stories through the players in this book was awesome.
Oh, well, thank you. That's something, like you said, that is very prevalent in life, and it's something I can relate to, too. I had a career in my 20s as a screenwriter, and yeah, it's very easy to get caught up in as I sort of like to say to people, when you're 27 and they're telling you you're a genius, it's very easy to believe them.
Right.
So, so that's kind of what I was, particularly with Lugosi, really the peak of his entire career is right after Dracula. He becomes a big star, and he'll never be quite as big a star again. And his turning down Frankenstein, some people believe, was, sort of the beginning of the decline. Not that he didn't make tons of amazing films, but he was never quite, as big a star as he was again after Dracula. Everybody knew who he was, but he wasn't getting offered the material that he deserved.
Right. I'm really interested in your history as a screenwriter. How did that start out? Again, I think we were chatting. Oh no, we said this earlier in this. I wanted to make films. And I started making films, and I went to film school, and my last year I made a big film that got me a lot of attention, and I signed with an agent. And you sort of have this fantasy you're going to sign with an agent, and they're going to hand you, at that time, a $50 million movie, and you're going to go off and have a career. Well, it doesn't quite work that way. You have to, for some people it does, but most it doesn't. You have to start producing material, and which was ironic because when I did start, I was like, well, I'm interested in everything but screenwriting. Right. And of course, that turned out to be my first big break. I wrote 7 really bad scripts. My 8th one was the first time that I wrote something that came from my life, which is I wrote a script about the Brooklyn Dodgers in New York. So it was Jews and baseball, it was basically the world that, I had grown up with. And literally, my life changed overnight. I literally, suddenly my agent sent it out. There was a bidding war, a fight, all this craziness went on. And I ended up getting a 3-picture deal to write for Disney out of it. Cool. And that was the beginning of my screenwriting career. And then it kind of, I had a nice run for about 10 or 15 years. And then, some of it was disenchantment. Some of it was you get older and, somebody else becomes the young, hot kid, and right. It's harder to get meetings and, all the stuff that happens. And so I transitioned into novels. And I also, in being honest, I didn't entirely learn the lesson that I should have with the success of that screenplay, which was writing something that was personal, that was unique,
after that, I reverted back to trying to write commercial stuff, and it wasn't as good, to be honest with you. And it didn't intrigue people as much because there was a million people writing the same type of stuff, where when you write something that's more unique and personal, it excites people because it's the only one like it.
That was Carl Laemmle right there. I saw that last little monologue. There was something really cool in the beginning of the book that I wrote down, and it was somebody asked Junior if he sees himself in the monster.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think, like, from like the research and everything, throwing the book together, do you think that he saw that as well or felt that?
Well, it's really fascinating because I'm obsessed with him because he's been kind of forgotten, and I, just as a side note, one of the really great things is that since this book has come out, I've had contact with so many of his relatives because they're
way.
Yeah, and it's been so fun hearing stories about him because the Laemmles lose Universal in 1936, and Junior lives another 40 years, but has nothing to do with the film business anymore. Carl, the father, dies a couple years later. So, it's been great hearing from them. Just what was he doing for those 40 years? And they all say wonderful things about him. And from that, and from my research, you can kind of put together as best. I'm still trying to figure him out entirely, but he definitely had a connection to the type of material which I talk about in the story with the flashback.
Yes.
And that's all real, and that's also based on interviews that right around the time, I don't want to give away the plot thing that happens in that flashback, but that's all real, and that was the point that he sort of took a turn and became interested in sort of the occult and darker stuff. So he definitely had a connection there, and he did feel a draw to Dracula and Frankenstein. I mean, that is absolutely true that he was the one that wanted to make these films, and he's the one that that fought for him. We're lucky, they wouldn't be here if it wasn't for him. These films that we love and this cycle that started with them are because of him. And in terms of the personal story, I do, one of the things that attracted me as a writer, when you think about Frankenstein, ultimately it's a father and son story. It's a creator who's not happy with his creation. Well, what's the relationship between Carl Laemmle Sr. and Carl Laemmle Jr.? He's not happy with his son or his creation, and he doesn't like what he's doing with his studio. So that was real, and that was something I felt to put into the story.
It was that translated very well into the book. Like there was a point in time, and I won't spoil the end, but where there's a conversation, I got a little misty, and I'll tell you why. This might seem really weird, but there was two movies that I kept thinking of while listening to this book, because there's a thing in this book where you almost kind of have to surrender to the flow of life. Like, there's a lot of things that are gonna happen, and I forget what the quote is. I was asking my fiance before, so I was like, "Who is this? Was it Oprah?" Because I always say every quote's I feel like every quote is an Oprah quote, or if it's not, you can just give it to her. And everyone's like, "That makes a lot of sense." But there's this quote about life won't present the opportunity until you're ready for it, and I saw a lot of that with Junior. Like, there was a lot of things happening, and he was making the right choices at the very right time to surrender to that flow and to be able to make Frankenstein into what it is. But there was two movies that came to mind. I'm curious to see, as a film lover, what you think.
Sure.
I saw there was a little bit of Slumdog Millionaire and Father of the Bride, which is weird. I know it's so weird, but that whole, like, you lose yourself. Father of the Bride, they realize, hey, we were young crazy kids at one point in time too. Yeah. I saw a little bit of that, and then the ending of Slumdog Millionaire, It Is Written. Like, everything is already written that's going to happen. I felt like that happened with these cats.
Oh, that's interesting.
At Universal, and it was kind of like, listening to it was kind of spiritual in a way.
Oh, well, thank you. Other people have said that about getting misty-eyed, and I'm very happy about that, because that, obviously I dedicated the film to my father, so it very much, that father-son relationship is kind of the center of it, like I said, because of the parallel in Frankenstein, and also with Carl Sr. and Jr.
One of the things that I really liked was the framing of this book. It was the 5 days till production. How did you come up with that Did it just come naturally, or
It's something you're always looking to create tension as a writer. So sort of having almost a countdown, and it's part of the story. That was unique about it was that films in general tend to be that very chaotic. My wife works in sitcoms primarily. She's a costumer, and she does a lot of pilots, and they are swapping actors out, right up until the last minute. And so, sometimes you're talking about somebody who signs on the day before and the show runs for 7 years, and they were not, 2 days before they were shooting it, they weren't that. So it's part of the film business, and it was part of the appeal to me that there was this back and forth, and that is based on fact. The first, and it's in the book, all of the quotes in the book, like you were talking about the countdown, and I have quotes, those are all real. It is historical fiction,
cool.
but every one of those quotes are real. And the very first time Boris Karloff is ever mentioned anywhere in relation to the film Frankenstein is the first day of production. There's one line in a small Los Angeles paper that says Boris Karloff has been signed to play the role of the monster in Universal's Frankenstein. So that's, there's nothing about it until the first day of production. So
wow.
that's kind of when I discovered all of that. And then, the other quotes where, it's 6 months before, 8 months before, Bela Lugosi will be playing the role, then 3 months out, Bela Lugosi has quit Frankenstein. And then the one that sort of sets everything off is that, Lugosi is now off the picture, but then there's this very famous letter, and again, I quoted in the book, that James Whale, the director of Frankenstein, sends to Colin Clive, who plays Dr. Frankenstein in the movie. Clive comes over from London on a boat, and it's about 2 weeks before the beginning of production of Frankenstein, and Colin Clive arrives in New York off of a boat from London, and the script is waiting for him there with a letter from James Whale. And in the letter, James Whale says, and playing the role of the monster will be either Bela Lugosi or Boris Karloff. So here it is 2 weeks before, and this is a fact in the letter from the director. We still don't know who's going to play this role. So welcome to Hollywood.
You hear so many behind-the-scenes stories of filmmakers, and that I kind of miss DVD extra special features, because I feel like a lot of times when you watch those, you would hear stories like that of the day before, someone dropped out, or the money drops out, or something like that, and the way you illustrate that chaos of pre-production. And I'll say this, I feel like pre-production is almost I might get crucified for this. I feel like pre-production is almost the more important skill. Because once everything gets rolling, everything's rolling. That pre-production is like the hardest battle ever. The money, the actors, the contracts, getting everything in place. That is chaotic.
No question. It's funny. Before we started recording, we were talking about Hitchcock, and he was very famous about saying that too. That when he had finished the storyboards, in his mind, the film was done. And that's all part of the pre-production. It was almost a letdown. Like it was never as good as what he had in his mind, from that. So no, it's true. I mean, it's those decisions you make. And, after that you sort of begin shooting and you have this vision of the film, and then it's just subtraction from there, because you know what you're starting with. And then you have to start, you get behind schedule, you run out of money, you have to start making changes and cut things.
How many times? Okay, let me ask you this. Do you remember the first time you watched Frankenstein?
I don't remember the literal, but I know that the first time would have been in the early 70s on television. There was, like a lot of people, there was a local, grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and the horror thing was Creature Features, which was shown every Friday and Saturday night at 11:30, and I couldn't wait for that to see what it was. And at some point they showed Frankenstein, and I had another buddy then who was obsessed with these films, and we were building the model kits and talking about it, but you couldn't just pop in the DVD or stream it or anything then. So you had to wait for them to show up. So it was sometime during then that I first saw it.
Writing the book, do you view the film any differently? Like, does it? Because I'll be honest, I view Karloff a little differently, and all in a great. I don't view anyone badly from the movie, but this really, I don't know, it made me just really want to hug Boris Karloff. He just seemed like such a jovial person.
He was. That's an interesting question. It hasn't changed my perception of the film, but it has made me like all of the people involved more, just reading more about them. They're all heroes to me. The three main characters are Junior Lemley, Boris Karloff, and Bela Lugosi. And the more I read about them, the more incredible I found them. They and what also excited me about writing this was all of their lives are completely changed coming out of this film.
Right.
Karloff obviously overnight becomes a huge star. Lugosi is never quite the same star that he, Karloff kind of takes a little bit of the space that Universal was kind of, wanted to push him into. And Junior, this was kind of his biggest triumph. He had other films at the time that may have gotten more acclaim, but not 90 years later.
Right.
So, that's kind of what, doing the research, what came out of it to me was just how much I appreciated what they had done. As you were saying, like Karloff had this 25-year career of being just a struggling actor. And Lugosi is amazing because he basically found a way 2 or 3 other times in his career to become an incredibly successful actor. First, he starts in Hungary, then he's successful at a very young age. Then he's in Germany, and he becomes very successful at a very young age. Then he comes to America and does it all over again. And, as somebody, we were talking about my early days in the film business, I had a ton of friends who were actors, and, you're lucky if you make it once, let alone 3 times.
Right.
And twice Bella did it in not even his native language.
Right.
So it just, all of that just made me admire him that much more. And like I said, Karloff, how he just continued to work at it, and how jovial he was. And, I say this all the time, but I really believe this. His performance in Frankenstein, I think, is one of the greatest performances you will ever see. I do not see him in it. When you look at the character, like you said, the sort of jovial sort of Englishman, there is none of him in that character of Frankenstein. It is just the greatest melding of a character and actor. It's just phenomenal.
So I recently became obsessed, mostly because of did you see the Ethan Hawke documentary that he did, The Last Movie Stars?
No, the Paul Newman.
Yeah, the Paul Newman one. Highly recommend it.
Oh, I'll definitely check it out.
It is so amazing. But I don't know anything about acting, right? And so when you watch something with Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward, like you're gonna learn a thing or two about the art of acting. And the one thing they kept saying that I thought helped me understand what acting is they kept saying what they were pulling from. Like they were like, from this performance I was pulling from a principal I had in high school or that, and that concept was like wild to me. I was like, oh my god, I never thought about that. I thought you look at a script, you read it, you come up with the character, director gives you some motivation and that's it. But like for the actor, it's there's way deeper than that. Like you're pulling from that. And when you talk about Karloff and like him being able to pull out his bridge to that, and it was during I think the screen test where he said I gave it my all, or like he was talking about like all the things in his life, and I was like, oh shit, that's what he's pulling from. Like that's what he's pulling from. So that performance, and that's what I was sort of wanted to get earlier was I kind of want to go back and watch Frankenstein now that I can see like where he's pulling from. One, because I learned what pulling from was, but two, where he got it from the book, and just view that character. And I think it's going to make it a lot more heartbreaking.
It's true. I mean, that's kind of why it was, it was such a success, that he put it all out there. He allowed himself, he's playing a monster, but he's so sympathetic and he's so vulnerable. He's, like any child that is brought into the world, they didn't ask to be brought into the world. And that's,
right.
That's what, the monster is. And, that's the brilliance of the film, and why it's still, it's not just to think about, oh, here's this horrible creature, now let's kill it. It's the vulnerability and, how he portrays it that is so remarkable, and why audiences still relate to it today.
Do you think there's any other portrayal of the monster that comes close? Because like we rewatched the what's his name, the Robert De Niro Frankenstein one, and we've seen a handful of others, but something about that is ice cold. Nothing can come close to it.
Nothing. It's lightning in a bottle. There's nothing that comes close. Now, to me, my personal favorite other version of the story is the 1974 TV movie. If you've ever seen that,
I've not seen that one.
It's fascinating because it's the book. If you've ever read the book of Frankenstein, as much as we love the movie Frankenstein, it's got nothing to do with the book. I mean, it's got the title and the basic,
Right.
premise, but no, this is a very literal adaptation of the book. And
Gotcha.
so I recommend that one for that. But in terms of what is people think of with Frankenstein, there's nothing that comes close. And, I enjoyed all the other actors. Like I said, my initial draw to it was that all these other actors had played the character, but nobody comes close. It's fun in the cycle to watch, when Bela Lugosi plays it or when Glenn Strange, that's all fun and still feels connected to the Karloff performance. But then when you get to the De Niro thing, that's just a whole other,
Yeah, I just
thing.
It's just him getting dragged around,
Yeah.
fluid, naked.
Yeah,
for a while.
every work of art, particularly when it's later, or is based on other material or a subject matter that's been explored, they have to find a reason sort of for it to exist. So their creation scene, the one in Frankenstein is incredible, but it's a fairly, it's not bloody and
Right.
gutty. It's just very dramatic and wonderful. So their decision was, well, let's go this way and make it sloppy and they're slipping and, and all that stuff, which is an interesting interpretation. I just, I like the original.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
Yeah.
I love how it's. I'm going to title it this, but I don't think it's the Karloff versus Lugosi. They're fighting each other, but they're not. They're
Yeah.
just happening to be in the same space for
Right.
it. And what I thought was really interesting is, I'll be on. I'll lay it on the line. If I had to say which actor I prefer to see, I think Karloff is a little bit of a better actor. I always like watching him. But I love Lugosi. But during the book, it felt like Bella had this really big ego because he didn't want to cover his face and stuff like that. And knowing how history played out, you're kind of like, oh, what a jerk. He could have just did it and been happy. But as the book went on, I didn't see his ego as this thing that made him a jerk. I saw it and it made me really sad for him a little bit. That like he held on to I don't want to be covered in makeup. I'm not Lon Chaney. I want the world. He kept saying I want them to see my face.
Right.
And I thought there was something really sad about it. How did that do you feel sad for him or what are your feelings? About that?
That's kind of the conventional wisdom on him. That's not. I mean, there's some truth and there's some that's not. Certainly through the 30s, he continued to do wonderful films and big films. A lot of them with Karloff, as we all know, they were paired together many times. I think but there is an element of it, But I sort of looked at it more that I understood why he felt that way. That I'm saying he fought so hard to succeed, and then to imagine, you become this big star and they want to put you in a film and cover your face, and you don't talk.
Yeah.
So
as these talkies are coming into
right,
play.
exactly. Like people are saying, "Oh, you'll never make the transition," and then he becomes a star in Dracula, a sound film, and then the first thing they want to do is sort of take his face and his voice away. So I felt sort of sympathetic to it more than anything.
Did you see any of yourself to go back to Junior? Did you see any of yourself in Junior? Because the way he's written, it feels like this. I'm gonna
1,000%. Like I said, I had success at in the film business, a measure of it at a relatively young age. So I remember how frankly full of myself I was then, and. But it was also exciting because you think you can do no wrong, and that's kind of what Junior was thinking, and it was fun. So yeah, absolutely. There's nothing better than having success early in life when you have sort of no constraints. You have no responsibilities. You don't have a family. You're making more money than you ever imagined you would make. I won't give numbers here, but when the first project that I did for Disney, they were apologizing to me because they were sending me on a research trip, and it was, in my perspective, a crazy amount of money that they were giving me per day as a per diem, and they were like apologetic about this is all we can give you. And I'm like, and
you gotta lie. That's fine. I don't make do.
Yeah, they sent me to New York first class. I'd never flown first class before.
Oh my gosh.
And this is 1991 when first class was really first class on an airplane.
Basically a small apartment.
Yeah, and yeah, exactly. And they're very apologetic about it. So I definitely felt a connection to Junior in his youth and excitement about films.
There was a line that it was one of those where I had pause the book and write it down. I really loved it because it was a great insight into how Junior thought. and it was when he's at one of the premieres, and Sydney comes up to him, and she's like, "Oh, you said he doesn't go to the event with her," and he does the typical producer, "I'm gonna brush you off, and I'll see you in the morning," kind of thing, and then I'll come up with whatever.
Yeah.
But she's like, mentions how it's tomorrow, and the line is, "Tomorrow is a million years away."
Yeah.
And I love that line. That was because to me, like he didn't just say that, like he believed that.
Yeah, and particularly at that moment in the story, he's juggling so many things. He's like, "I'll get to tomorrow when I get it. When it comes, I got to solve all these other problems." Yeah,
the battle that Junior goes through in the book, I think is a great one. It is this: do I continue the legacy, take the promotion from my father, or do I break off from that? Do I get into this, almost, I feel like Pink Floyd would sing about it. You get into this, 10 years, you look behind, that kind of, like, does he go that path, follow his father, or does he do the radical thing and like sort of follow his heart and his ideas? And the way you set that up and that tension between the two of them was so intriguing.
Oh, well, thank you. That was another moment in the development of the story, just another part that wasn't working. And then when I really sort of built it around that decision that he has to get what he wants, but to get it, there's a sacrifice. And,
have you felt any of those sacrifices in your creative career?
Not so much sacrifices, more as just bad choices. Like I said, I got success with a particular type of material instead of looking at that material and going, wow, that's what they reacted to. I mean, I cannot tell you the difference it was. Again, I don't want to overstate this, but I was getting nowhere, and then suddenly overnight I was taking meetings at every studio in town. They just freaked out over this script I wrote, and instead of going, wow, look, you did something different, look what it did, I just went back to I wanted to chase the success instead of the quality that was in that script. I learned the wrong lesson.
Do you remember the moment where like it clicked and you were like, oh, son of a bitch?
I've done it was probably about 10 years ago. It took about 20 years it was when I started writing novels, because the novels have had much stronger reaction, because when I continued writing screenplays, I was still, the most important thought was, is it commercial? And when I started writing novels, I didn't have to worry about that. I wasn't writing, or when I did studio assignments, you're dealing with input from so many different people, and very little of it is what you want to write ultimately. And so once that was when it really clicked in, and I wrote my first novel about, I guess it's almost 15 years ago now, 12 or 13 years ago. And the response to it, and the same way that I enjoyed writing it, I realized I just wrote what I was passionate about, and it was a whole different reception to most of my screenplays after that first one that got me all that work.
Was there what was the transition like from screenplays to novels? Was there any sort of learning curve, or like what
there was. I had done, before the first one that I completed, about 8 or 9 years before that, I had sort of stopped writing screenplays and taken a first crack at writing a novel, and I learned a lot from that, and I need to go back to that one, but I never really, I sort of finished a couple of drafts of the manuscript and kind of abandoned it and went back to screenplays for a number of years. And instead of going back and finishing that one up, I started something new. But I learned a lot about that. There was definitely, a learning curve. I used to lecture a lot on screenwriting. I had various friends who became professors after we went to film school together, and I would always go out and talk about screenwriting. And one of the biggest bits of advice, and I'm just giving it as what worked for me, is that I don't believe in rewriting the same script over and over again for 10 years. I think you need to write it, get notes, rewrite it, and then send it out into the world, and either it works or it doesn't, then move on to the next one, because I don't think you can learn the lesson until you move on to the next one.
That's a great lesson.
Yeah, that worked for me personally, because I knew people that kept working on the same screenplay for 4 or 5 years and it wasn't getting better.
And you look at him and you're like, come on, man, set it and forget it. Just move on. There was a God, I forget what the book is, but it was about like how creative ideas have a shelf life, and it's like you don't keep expired milk in the fridge. You're like, we got to get rid of it and throw in something new. I really liked comparing Bella to Carl. I thought they both sort of had this same sort of journey of, they wanted to hold on to this thing. They wanted to hold on to this thing. Do you see any similarities like between the two of them? Like,
That's interesting. I never really thought. I mean, they were both certainly in both of their Bella and Carl Laemmle Sr. Both of them, you could say English wasn't their first language, even though Carl Sr. had been here much longer than Bella. I didn't really draw a parallel. Like all of them, of all of the characters, I will say this in the story that are kind of major characters, Carl Laemmle Sr. in a lot of ways was the hardest one for me to completely understand. Like I understood Junior and I understood Boris and Bella because if you look at and because Carl Laemmle Sr. is, we were again talking about this earlier, is one of many moguls at the time, but all of those other guys had a very similar story. They were kind of like struggling, they had to fight their way up from the street. Carl Laemmle Sr. at every step of his life was comfortable. He was comfortable in Germany. He was sort of middle class, but chose to come to America. He came to America. He ends up in I believe, Oshkosh, Wisconsin. He's kind of a pillar of the community. He's working in a successful store in his early 40s, and yet decides, no, I want something like he constantly seems to be looking for something, but he's always succeeding. Where a lot of these other moguls, I think Ray Cohn sold sheet music on the street. I mean, people, these were not guys that had sort of the success that Carl Laemmle Sr. had. So I always found that fascinating that I never entirely got what drove him, and he was a monster. I mean, any of those guys that, they created this industry, and I love telling this story that, Carl founded Universal Studios, and he opens it with huge fanfare in 1915. You know when the first tour starts of Universal Studios? In 1915. Like he immediately said, yeah, he just immediately saw everything you could do. In 1915, when Universal Studios opens on the same spot it's on today, you could take a bus from Hollywood Boulevard to the studio, and for 25 cents you could watch them. They built grandstands, which I talk about in the book, and it was silent stages then, and they were lined up, and you sat up there and watched them make movies. So he had this vision of how to exploit every aspect of filmmaking, but I still don't know what drove him, because he always succeeded, he was always comfortable, yet he kept wanting more in a weird way, but I don't know why, because it wasn't, I need more because I'm afraid I'll end up on the street, because he never really was on that. Like, it's just fascinating to me.
Just like a unicorn of a man, just like wandering through life.
just fascinating. And you read, he had a great reputation. Everybody called him Uncle Carl, and he was famous for hiring lots of family members, where the stories of the other guys of how tough they were and how much they were SOBs are very famous. You never hear that in relation to Carl Laemmle Sr., and yet he took on Edison, who had a patent on filmmaking, and beat him at that. So he was tough, but he just didn't have the sort of the real. There just aren't the stories that you hear about the other guys.
I loved the part of the book talking about his train ride out here, and him reading through court cases with Edison, like that line, reading about court cases with Edison, just flipping through like for like the future of film. Like it always blows my mind, just like how we're not that far removed from the invention of all this.
Oh no, not at all. It is astounding how relatively new an art it is, and how quickly it went from not existing to being the preeminent art form. This mass communication that nobody had ever seen before on that scale.
And even like the resilience of it, like with all the theaters, like there's still a couple arc lights that that are opening them back up, but like all the other movie theaters around, like when they were died out, COVID came, nobody was seeing theaters, it's instantly packed again. Like people just absolutely love these movies.
Yeah.
And I don't think I'll ever get tired of hearing about this, like these years of Hollywood.
It's just fascinating as they're trying to figure this thing out, and it was a time, where they were obviously in a lot of ways making even more money than today because they weren't taxed, and there's all it's just it's quite an era.
The one thing that I never thought about when it came to these old movies is the distributors or the studios paying people to freak out in a theater. For some reason that never crossed my mind, even though I was like, oh my god, that's where Roger Corman probably got all of that.
And that was the one thing that Carl, when I talk about the difference between Carl Laemmle Sr. and Jr., his son Senior was very famous for those stunts. That was kind of his bread and butter. And I don't know if I go too far into this in the book, but he really is credited with really creating the first movie star, because in 1912 there was up until then, actors were just known as like the Biograph girl, meaning she worked for Biograph films, and they weren't known as names. He famously got a well-known actor away from another studio, lured her away with money. Her name was Florence Lawrence, and he staged this whole crazy thing that was completely made up, that he put out a rumor that she had died. And there was this whole uproar that she was dead, just so that they could then say, no, it's not true. In fact, she's going to make an appearance in St. Louis, to prove that she's still alive. And sure enough, Florence Lawrence shows up in St. Louis, and is the train, when she arrives, is greeted with tens of thousands of people.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and that's kind of that was the beginning of the movie star era, where he went, wow, okay, we need to market these people, not just as the Biograph girl or this and that, and that's sort of credited with the beginning of the movie stars.
His mind is fascinating,
Yeah.
because there's part of it where, the first thing I think of when you think of like cheap theater gimmicks is you think they're just that, cheap theater gimmicks. You think of House on Haunted Hill with the skeleton swings through the theater, stuff like that. But that was my first thought. But after I sat with it, I was like, well, why not fuck with the audience?
Yeah,
you're messing with them on the screen. None of that's real.
That's a good point.
So why not bring that nonsense into the theater and spook people more? Like to me, it's just like pure showman. Like he was like, even when you're sitting in the theater, you're not safe. Like I'm going to entertain you. I'm going to get your 4 cents or whatever a movie costs. Cost back then, however I can, through pure entertainment.
Well, why not have fun with it?
Yes.
That's it. It seemed that was the one thing you will also see with the Laemmles, with both where Senior and Junior had in common. They loved to throw a party. You can read it in accounts at the time. They were known for that, and that's the one thing. Like I said, the relatives of Junior who reached out to me, once the book came out, that's the one thing that came up. They always talked about his parties over, after he left the business. Well, I guess he was still technically somewhat connected, but he just had wonderful parties. He was famous for that.
I would love to go to one of those parties.
Oh, I cannot tell you, I would give anything. And what was really fun in the research was I'd be reading somebody else's biography or autobiography, and suddenly the Laemmles would pop up, and it was always exciting. And there was a book written by the writer who wrote, oh God, this is terrible, Bud Schulberg, who wrote What Makes Sammy Run, and he wrote On the Waterfront, big screenwriter. Gotcha. And his father he grew up around the film business. His father had been an executive at Paramount, and he put out a book, I don't know how many years ago, it was a autobiography of just his experiences growing up in Hollywood. And all of us, having read the book, you can imagine my reaction when I got this. All of a sudden, he talks about going to a party at the Laemmles' house. And I just forget, but it gets better if you remember this. Guess who he went, and this is in reality, guess who he goes to the party with, and this is real. Sidney Fox, who's if you remember, that's the actress that Junior in my book. So I couldn't believe this.
Wow.
This is real. This isn't just I was like, oh my God, this is the kind of thing that you could do research for 1,000 years and never find. And here it is, him telling a story of going to a party at the Laemmles with Sidney Fox, who was character in my book.
You discover that like Junior discovers the test footage.
Just kind of
later in your life, like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
We got something big here.
Yeah, I couldn't believe that when I found that in his autobiography, that he had, this is a real moment from 1929, or I guess it would have been 32 or something, when he went to this party.
That is so awesome. The there was 2 countdown framings in the book. One was the production. The other one was how much money Karloff had in his pocket. And I really, really love that because the less money he had, the more I got. I mean, I knew, he's gonna lay Frankenstein, but still, you're just living with him in that moment. He didn't know anything could change last minute. So when he's when he buys the cigar and he uses up his last dollar, I love the fact that he doesn't actually start living until he has no money. Once he hits $0, he splurges on a 25-cent cigar, and then he's just looking at the penny, enjoying life.
Yeah,
I thought that was so amazing, and I don't know. It just I keep tying it back into this like surrendering to life aspect, which is funny. Surrendering to life, Frankenstein. It's this weird storm of things that all just kind of makes sense.
Yeah, no, that I really wanted to illustrate where he was in his career. I mean, another really incredibly gratifying moment that has come since the book came out is I got a wonderful quote from I got a letter from and a quote from Boris Karloff's daughter, Sarah Karloff, who wonderfully is still alive. And she read the book and really enjoyed it. And she wrote, this thing saying that it was a really fun read and great insight into it. And she put it at the end. She said, illustrating how Frankenstein made my father an overnight star after 20 years in the film business. And that's the truth of it, that, he had been struggling. He had little moments of success and little bits here and there. I think Frankenstein is like his 87th movie that he was in.
Gosh.
Yeah. But this is what I sort of say to people to give you an idea of where he was, though, before Frankenstein. After he shoots Frankenstein, there's a movie that comes out, a big, a regular, Hollywood movie. It was shot before he acted in it before Frankenstein came out, or I'm sorry, he acted in it before Frankenstein was made, but it came out right after it. And in that, his character is called Waiter. Doesn't even have a name. His character doesn't even, that just shows you.
He's a nobody.
Yeah, he's a bit actor, still fighting his way in the business. And then, you cut to within months, suddenly like, one of his next films is The Mummy. And when you see the promotion for The Mummy, all you see above the title is the word Karloff. It's even bigger than the title of the movie. So it changed very quickly, deservedly so for him.
If I had made the other movie, I'd be like, get the editor, get someone. We got to put his name. we got to get some more money. Yeah. We got to get some more money out of this. Okay. So for the listeners who are creative, what advice would you give to creative writers in this field?
Well, it's a cliche, but in my case, it was true. Write what you know. As I was telling that story, I wrote 7 lousy scripts that were frankly just based on other movies I've seen. Then suddenly I wrote something personal, which was baseball and growing up in a Jewish family in Brooklyn and all of that. And everything changed. Write the story that is unique to you. There's amazing writing that doesn't necessarily have to come for that, but I guess find, like you were saying, I didn't grow up in the 30s in the, working for Universal Studios, but as you were bringing out, there were aspects of the character that I could relate to, particularly with Junior and, and all of that. Or if you're doing research, talk to other people about their experiences. I'm surrounded by a lot of friends who are actors, so that aspect of it also appealed to me. It's a fascinating field. It's very, very tough, but some people do make it and some don't, and it's interesting watching all of that.
Well, write what you know your monsters, your Universal history. I like this book has to be on everyone's October read. Like it I mean, it goes hand in hand, right? Light your thunderstorm candles, get a big pot of coffee. And if you're a horror fan, this has to be on the bookshelf. It's such a fun read. And I feel like now when I'm driving around LA, when I see the Laemmle theaters, I'm going to be thinking of them a little differently. That
was started by one of Carl's brothers, the Laemmle chain.
And they're great.
Yeah.
R.I.P. the one in Pasadena. I think that one closed.
Yeah, I know.
But we got one in Glendale now, so it's a little bit closer. So, Julian, thank you so much for coming on. This was fantastic.
My pleasure. Anytime. I love talking about it, and it's been great chatting with you.
And they can pick up the book Amazon.
Your most bookstores should have it, and you can also go to juliandavidstone.com if you want a signed copy of it.
Perfect.
You can get them there, and also read more about me and the film. Or in the book in general.
Sounds good. All right. Well, until next time, stay scary. Read a bunch of horror books. I usually end it on the movies, but this time do a little reading. Read It's Alive. Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. This has been a blast.